Hello and welcome to our second lecture. This one we're going to be focusing on the origin and evolution of cities in what's known as the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia. That's the land between the rivers. We're moving on from last week where we talked about hunters and gatherers and the emergence of agriculture, and we're going to be focusing on exactly how that plays out and leads to the creation of the first large cities. Okay, so first and foremost, let's talk a little bit about the region we're going to be focusing on. It's known as Mesopotamia, which is a Greek word. It means the land between the rivers. The rivers in question are the Tigris and the Euphrates. And on this kind of global map here, the satellite image, which I've chosen so that you can see a little bit of what the ecology looks like from a far distance, you can see this pink circle. Inside the pink circle is the region we're referring to. And you can see this kind of dark smudge kind of in the middle. That in particular is the fertile, agriculturally rich area known as Mesopotamia. This entire zone is referred to as the Fertile Crescent. It goes from the delta of the Tigris and Euphrates and then kind of arches up and circles back over toward the Mediterranean. And this region is the first place on Earth where large cities are going to be formed. Now, there are going to be some competitors for this, and it depends really on how you define city, when you can put your finger on when these cities exactly emerged and when they were first definable as cities, because they all grow out, whether we're talking about Mesopotamia or Egypt or China or the Americas or Europe or anywhere where cities eventually develop. The actual definition of what makes a city instead of a village or a town or just kind of a large group of people who happen to be assembled for some reason is going to vary depending on who you talk to. For our purposes, we're going to be speaking fairly generally. We're going to define a city as a dense population of people that are living together, that pursue not all the same job. So instead of everybody being a person who is farming and then everybody makes their own shoes and everybody builds their own house and everybody kind of does what they have to do to make a living, much the way we see with hunter-gatherers. In a city life, you have people specialize. So you have people who build houses and that's what they do. You have people who defend the city, and that's what they do. They don't spend their day farming, although they might supplement here and there. Instead, you have specialization. You see other structures that we associate with a city being defined as a city. So you have a dense population, a large enough population, and you have people who kind of specialize in their jobs and do different things. And then there are certain types of architecture we associate with cities as well. Walls for defense. Not every city has them, but many do. As well as temple structures, governmental building structures, taller buildings, that kind of thing, are all sometimes roped into the definition of a city. So now that we've gone through that kind of general background, let's talk specifically about Mesopotamia. This region is ideal in many ways for the development of cities, and there's a good reason that the first and earliest cities of the ancient world are going to emerge here. The farmland in Mesopotamia is enormously productive. It's hugely rich. The soil is going to be replenished and enriched by the flooding of the rivers seasonally. However, the downside to farming in this region is that the area is actually fairly arid, most of it. Down by the delta, it's marshy, but it's fairly arid. There's not a ton of rainfall all the time. And so really the land by the river is super great for agriculture. But if you get even a little bit outside, if you get away from the river, it's much harder. You're not going to get a ton of vegetation. It's not a particularly rich and luxurious environment, which makes it hard to kind of live out in the bush, to live away from the river and live away from places where you might cultivate food intensively. So there's a big payoff if you do want to farm, but the downside is if you don't actively pursue agriculture, there's not a lot of food in the immediate environment that's there for you. In addition to there not being a lot just kind of naturally growing about once you get a little bit away from the rivers, there's also the added challenge of controlling the water from the rivers. And so this is part of what I'm showing in this slide here. So you can see there's a date palm plantation up on the right, and down on the bottom left you can see one of the it's really kind of an ancient relic, part of an irrigation system that was dividing water that was being diverted from a channel away from the river and then sent out into the growing fields. This is how agriculture works in these river systems. The river is the source of most of the water. There's not a ton of rain, or at least not reliable rain. There is some seasonally, but there's not a ton of rain. So the river is the main source of water. And so you have to dig irrigation ditches in order to bring it from the river into the field where it can water your crops. In addition to that, you have to, in the case of the Tigris and Euphrates in particular, you have to worry about occasions where the river might unexpectedly flood. And this happens in Mesopotamia quite often. There can be storms upriver, there can be a major event, and the next thing you know, the river is flooding. And this happens in Mesopotamia at times that are quite inconvenient for agriculture. It's not predictable all the time. In Egypt, it's a bit of a different situation. We'll talk about that next week. The Nile tends to flood seasonally and predictably. But in Mesopotamia, that's not always the case, and it will flood at times when you could have your field already planted, then the river floods and it washes your field away and everything is wrecked. So to prevent that, people who farm in Mesopotamia have to dig not only ditches to bring water in, they have to dig and create systems of dikes and levees to keep water out, so that if the river floods unexpectedly, it doesn't just wash into their field and wreck everything. Now, when you combine those two things, farming in Mesopotamia is really labor intensive. It involves having to dig a lot of ditches, maintain those ditches, build dikes and levees, maintain those, constantly having to clear channels out and reroute things and make sure everything's working the way it should work, and managing water levels. It's really labor intensive. And this is a key to why agriculture is going to be a bigger operation in Mesopotamia, and why cities are going to develop in Mesopotamia. Because agriculture is really challenging. The more people you have to work, the more people you have to dig, the more people you have to manage, the more people you have to pick up the slack if somebody gets injured, the more successful farming is going to be in this environment, because it is so high labor. The upside, however, even though it's a lot of work to do this kind of farming, the upside is that the land is tremendously productive. If everything works the way it should, this agricultural space produces enormous amounts of food. Grains, the early sort of ancestors of modern barley and wheat, are produced in large amounts. Dates, palms are grown. You can see that picture there, that produce a form of sugar. And the dates themselves, they can produce enormous surpluses, way more food than is necessary to feed their population. And those surpluses mean that the community can trade. They can have this extra food that they can swap with other groups of people for other things that they want and need. We'll get into more detail about that in just a bit. So it's a huge payoff if you can make it work, but it's really difficult. There's another aspect of that, which we're going to explore as well. Because the system of irrigation is quite complex, that's necessary to make this farming work out in Mesopotamia, you have to have quite a bit of organization. You have a lot of people all working. Everybody wants to see a profit. Everybody wants to prosper. Nobody wants their fields wrecked and destroyed, but they're all working on these interconnected irrigated systems. If somebody drops the ball, many people can suffer as a result. And so for that reason, it makes sense that this is going to be where a more complicated political system is going to emerge as well, that we're going to find in the first cities. Because if you're living like this, where you're working together with a lot of people doing very intensive physical work, where if somebody drops the ball, everybody gets just wrecked up, you're in a position where you not only need to make sure that there's an organizer, somebody who's keeping track of everybody and making sure everybody is doing what they should be doing, but you also need to have systems in place so that if something happens, if your neighbor is failing to maintain his levee and your field might get flooded as a result, you need to be able to complain to somebody, make him do it for him, whatever, because he's endangering the community. So this kind of system is going to lend itself to much more, I guess you could say, aggressive governmental intervention. People who are overseeing what people are up to and are able to more easily kind of enforce the rules about how things are supposed to work. Okay, so that's just speaking generally. Moving on, I'm showing you this map. It's just a bit of an indication. It's a close-up of that same region, Mesopotamia. And I wanted to show it to you because it has both modern and ancient cities marked on it. In the middle, you can probably see Baghdad. There's a few like little planes on there to indicate where there are airports. There's Kuwait City and Basra. You can see them on there. And kind of mixed in, if you squint your eyes and look really close, you can see names like Ur and Uruk, Lagash. Those are down toward the south, toward the delta region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where it's the land is the most rich and most kind of constantly being enriched by the river flooding. And this is where the very first cities in the world are going to be founded. This is where they're going to be built. There are some ruins you can go and see. Some of these have been damaged in recent years. But this one, you can still go see the archaeological site of the city of Ur. That you can still see the remnants of it and the foundations of some of the buildings and palace complexes and temple complexes and the city walls, and all of that kind of thing. The very first city, probably in the world. Now, there are other communities that are older than this. There are settled places where people are living and practicing agriculture that go back thousands of years earlier. But those places are small. They're on a small scale. There's not that many people living in them. People are practicing agriculture, but they seem to be practicing agriculture more or less as independent agents. Everybody is farming, everybody's still making their own house, everybody's still making their own clothes, that kind of thing. You don't get the specialization and you don't get like the governmental buildings that identify what a city is. That being said, when I say city, it's natural for modern people to picture a big place with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people inside. You shouldn't imagine that when we think about the ancient world. Most of these early cities, these ancient cities, especially when we're talking about the very, very beginnings of what we'll call the Bronze Age, the beginnings of the city of Uruk, for instance, in 4500 BC, even in Ur, where this ruin is depicting, in 3800 BC. These are really small communities. 5,000 people was considered a sizable city. That was big for the ancient world. They still had governmental buildings, they still had walls, they still had marketplaces, they had all the things you'd identify with a city, but they're really teeny tiny. They're only going to grow into the tens of thousands toward the middle of our time period we're going to talk about today, in the 2000s BC, which is still a long time ago. But that process is going to take quite a while. Okay, so that being said, these oldest cities are identified by some of the features that we've talked about. They often have walls around them when we talk about Mesopotamia. Now, that is giving us a clue as to what life was like in Mesopotamia. And we see all kinds of archaeological records. Most of what we know about these early cities is not from written records, not when we're talking about 4000 BC, 3000 BC. What writing there is from this time period and a bit later is really, really fragmentary. It's pictographic. You get names, like lists of names, and almost nothing else. You don't get like whole records or chronicles about what was going on in the city. So most of what we know about these places comes to us from archaeology, from digging down, finding what the buildings looked like, finding out what's wonderful for archaeologists if you find like old garbage heaps, because you can find what kinds of things people were wearing and eating and doing, and there's all kinds of wonderful information in there. Even so, we're limited by what survives. We can dig down and find foundations of buildings, but often bits and pieces of day-to-day life become invisible. Fabric decays, many things break down and just don't survive. Things that are built out of stone are fantastic for archaeologists because they last a long time. But plenty of structures are not built out of stone, and we're looking at the mark left in a ground after a wooden post decays. Now, that's part of why ancient scholars love Mesopotamia, and even more than Mesopotamia, they love Egypt, because it's a place where there's not a lot built out of wood. There's a lot built out of stone because they just don't have a lot of woodland. And as a result, the buildings and structures and monuments of those places last so much better, and it's so satisfying for scholars to look at them. It doesn't mean that other places didn't have fantastic buildings and fantastic structures and cities and whatnot as well, but if you were looking at Europe, if you were looking at other places where things are primarily being built out of wood, those decay, and 6,000 years later, there's nothing to see. So, anyway, moving on after that blathering. As I mentioned, the cities of the Bronze Age, and I'll define Bronze Age for you in a little bit, are characterized by certain features in Mesopotamia. They mostly do have walls around them. And what that suggests, because building a wall is very labor intensive, it's hard to do, it takes up a lot of people's time and energy, quarrying stone, putting it together, etc. Building walls is labor intensive, so if they bothered to build walls, what that suggests is that there are dangers, that the city fears attack from outside. And that makes complete and total sense. If you are in a settled agricultural community on the banks of the river, and you can see this beautiful artist's rendition has the fields outside the city, so it gives you an indication of how that would be constructed. So if you have this beautiful community next to the river, you're farming, everything is going great, you're producing lots of grain. When the grain is harvested, it would be brought inside city walls and stored in large grain store houses for safety and security, as well as protection from the elements and animals and all that kind of stuff. But if you're living in this community, you're producing tons of food. You're producing the equivalent tons of wealth. You have all the stuff you've swapped for food. You've got all of these wonderful, beautiful luxuries that are produced by living in this way. You are enjoying that, but you're also making yourself a target for groups of people who maybe live in the town, village, or city up the river, or maybe live up in the hills. In Mesopotamia in particular, there's this constant problem of invaders coming down from the hills, from the Zagros Mountains, sweeping in, attacking the cities and the farms, looting everything they can, and dashing off again, or sometimes trying to conquer. It really sort of depended. But the fact is, if you're an agricultural community, unlike hunters and gatherers, you accumulate lots of stuff that can be stolen. You farm for the whole season, you collect your whole huge harvest, it's sitting there in your beautiful storehouse, and you're now a sitting duck. You're vulnerable because somebody could come sweeping into your city, steal it all, and you've wasted all this time and now you have nothing to eat. That's a terrible disaster. You don't want that to happen. And so because they're rich targets and because they're vulnerable to attack from outside, the cities build walls to protect themselves. This has a couple of consequences beyond simply protection. It does protect from invaders. It does encourage people to consolidate as well. So all of those farms that are producing grain, it makes sense for them when a harvest comes to send their grain inside the walls. To keep it and store it there. Now, some of the people, you can sort of see that maze in the middle, are living inside the city. That's where their homes are. Some of them maybe are not. They might be living in small houses outside. But the city is the place of retreat. It's the place of safety. It's where you go in to go to the marketplace. It's where you go in to go buy your shoes or whatever. And it's where you bring your grain for safekeeping. This is a cornerstone of what we'll call the Bronze Age economy. It's something called the redistributive economy, where all of the farms from all of that farmland are producing grain or date palms, or I guess they're not producing the palms, they're producing the dates. They're producing whatever it is they produce. At the end of the growing season, they pay at least a big chunk of it in taxes. and store the rest inside the city for safekeeping. It all comes into a centralized storehouse, and then decisions are made, whether it's by a council of elders or a political leader. Decisions are made about what to do with the surplus, what to do with this extra grain. And then trade arrangements are made over a long distance, so all the food and agricultural produce comes flowing into the center, and then it's redistributed back out. It's redistributed in a number of ways. Some of them trade, some of them it's used to pay for people who aren't actively farming. That's one of the marks of a city versus another type of way of living as an agriculturalist, as in a village or whatever. People are able to live without actively doing their own farming. You could be a soldier, and that is your full-time profession, and that's what you do. You guard the walls, you guard the territory, you go out and fight wars against other cities or bandit groups or whoever you're going to fight against, and those people have to be fed, and the redistributive economy ensures that happens. So the food comes flowing in, it's divvied up by some kind of governmental faculty, and then it is redistributed back out. That's the economic system we associate with the Bronze Age. So you have a city, you have a wall. Inside the walls, you have features like marketplaces and temples, governmental buildings, grain storehouses, all of that kind of wonderful thing. And then outside, you have the farmland. Okay, speaking of buildings that have both religious and storage facilities. In Mesopotamia, we do find the ruins of buildings that seem to have been used as grain storehouses, quite large ones. The ziggurats were not necessarily that. Ziggurats were palace temple structures. And whatever you might have heard from whoever you might have heard it, pyramids are typically not used as any kind of storage aside from the tombs of the ancient kings because they're mostly solid. There's not really a lot of empty space inside them. They do have a symbolic purpose and a religious purpose. The shape of the step pyramid. In Mesopotamia, you don't get those smooth-sided pyramids. Instead, what you get are what's known as the ziggurats or step pyramids. So they will look roughly pyramid shaped, but it's really just a series of platforms built on top of each other with sloping sides. And these are meant to represent symbolically a mountain, a connection between the earth and the heavens. And they are meant to be a focus for religious power, a sort of a demonstration of the wealth and building capacity of a city. They have a lot of different functions, and they're characteristic of what we see in these ancient cities. Okay, so before we get into more discussion of what we find in the Bronze Age, let's talk a little bit about what the Bronze Age really is. Okay, so for our purposes in our class, now you can fudge these dates a little bit. You can push it a little bit older when you first see the very first creation of bronze, and you can push it a little bit later if you want, where there are still traces and remnants of people living in the same kind of style we're going to talk about. But for our purposes in our class, we're going to talk about the Bronze Age as being between roughly 3000 BC to roughly 1100 or 1000 BC. And this time period is known as the Bronze Age. It's given this name by archaeologists mostly. It's known as the Bronze Age because in major urban centers, in major large communities, wherever you find a big archaeological dig where a lot of people were living, you find bronze artifacts. Now, bronze is a metal. It's an alloy made of a combination of copper and tin. And it has advantages over other types of metals that were produced before and during the same time period. If you were to produce, say, a copper knife, this did happen sometimes. If you were to produce, say, a copper knife or a copper helmet or something, there's an immediate problem with that. Copper will oxidize. It turns that green. It breaks down over time, and it's fairly soft. So if you create a copper knife, it's very difficult to keep a hard, sharp edge on it. It gets dull very easily. It bends very easily. It's kind of frustrating to deal with a copper knife. Similarly, you could try to make things out of iron. Iron is everywhere. in the Europe and the Mediterranean. You can find iron deposits all over the place. The problem with iron is that the technology of the time, the fires that were used to create metal, weren't hot enough to begin the process of turning iron into steel. And the process of turning iron into steel was not known. And so as a result, the iron they had was what we would think of as like cast iron, if you ever had dealt with a cast iron pan or something. It's heavy. It has its uses, and people did use it. It's heavy. It's fairly brittle, though. If you were to drop it, it would crack. And so you can't make it super thin because it's not flexible enough. And since you can't make it thin, if you were to try to make armor out of iron, it would weigh a bajillion tons, and also would have, if it were strong enough to actually work, if you were to try to make a knife or another blade out of iron, you could do spear points, etc. The downside is that they're very heavy. They're hard, but they're also brittle. They're almost like stone in that way. They will break on you. Bronze was an enormous leap forward because by combining copper and tin, it was possible to create a metal that was flexible enough and melted at a low enough temperature that you could form it into all kinds of things. You could make it into weapons, you could make it into armor, you could make it into jewelry, you could make it into tools. And in addition to being easily formed, it was hard enough to hold a sharp edge. So you could use your knife over and over without having to sharpen it constantly. It didn't immediately bend or get dull if you whacked it on something. And in addition to that, if you made armor, the armor was strong enough that it wasn't going to immediately fail you if you got stabbed or smashed or something along those lines. And the extra special bonus of bronze is that it doesn't rust and it doesn't oxidize in the same way as copper and iron would. And so therefore you have this fantastic metal. It's useful for all kinds of things. You can make all kinds of tools out of it. It can be exposed to moisture and not get wrecked. It is fantastic. And so communities that have bronze have an enormous advantage over those that don't. If you can create bronze tools and weapons, you can perform your work more efficiently and you can better defend your population and your city than people who don't have it. And so, one of the things that those ancient cities spent their surplus grain on is in bringing in the materials they needed for bronze production. And this is where it gets really interesting and exciting during this time period between 3000 and 1000 BC, roughly. Because copper is fairly common. You can see those green dots. They represent where you find copper ore. You find copper kind of scattered around Europe and the Mediterranean. There's big deposits of it all over the place. There are a lot of them over where Mesopotamia is, just to the north, up by the Black Sea. So you can see it says bronze on the map. If you look just a little to the north there, you find that that's where a lot of the copper comes from. That is going to be used to run the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia. However, if you look at the blue dots, what you find is that tin is vexingly much less common. You don't find it in as many places, and here's the fascinating part. Tin, which is necessary for the production of bronze, is not found in large quantities right around the Mediterranean. It's not found very close to Mesopotamia. The biggest tin deposits, some of the most reliable ones, are found in Spain, northern France, and Britain, oddly enough. And so what's really was earth-shaking and fascinating, we found this out in about the 1990s. If you were to study bronze pieces, you can see a few examples here, from the ancient world, from ancient Mesopotamia, for instance, if you were to look at a bronze knife or a helmet or an armband, that's what that is there, and you were to analyze the bronze in there and do an analysis of the isotopes and trace elements that they find, either in the bronze itself or in ingots of tin that are sometimes found in archaeological sites, what was shocking to find out is that in many places, the tin that was used to fuel the Mediterranean Bronze Age came from Britain. It was shipped that far. Now, that doesn't mean that people from ancient Ur got on a ship and traveled all the way to Britain themselves, but there was a trade network that connected really far-flung areas in the Bronze Age. These trade networks were moving goods, particularly the material for bronze, over really staggeringly far distances. And this requires a lot of organization. It requires a lot of thinking about how you're going to do that and communicate with all these different suppliers and move things from one place to another. And before we move on, this picture here is actually Egyptian, which I'm going to try not to do too badly because we are talking about Mesopotamia for the moment. But it is a depiction of the production of bronze, which was quite a complicated process. You can see people cutting down fuel. You can see them building a fire, moving crucibles around. Production of bronze was an absolutely crucial component to the political and military security of these early cities. What they produce, and you can see examples there. There's a helmet and an armband and a knife there. What they produce are the goods and materials that they need, particularly weaponry, that gives them an edge over people who don't have the resources to produce bronze. And because it takes specialists with expertise, it takes the ability to bring in goods from long distances in order to create bronze, then cities, people who live in cities who have those resources, are going to get a big edge over everybody who doesn't. So if they're still hunters and gatherers that are living way out in the back of beyond, if they're pastoralists, they're herding people who live up in the Zagros Mountains and travel with their herds of sheep and goats, if they're people who are just living in a small village, what you find during this time period between 3000 and 1100 is that increasingly those kinds of places can't really compete. If they're attacked by people who have bronze armor and weapons, they get conquered. If they try to attack people with bronze armor and weapons, they get destroyed. And so the cities are going to grow, at least in part because of this, because of their bronze tools and bronze weapons. It's going to have a consolidating effect. The more surplus they have, the better they can conduct long distance trade. The more bronze they have, the more dominant they become in the region. It becomes a cycle, reinforcing itself. Okay, so the next thing up that you should know is that this cycle is going to be perpetuated through long distance trade, and that requires a couple of pieces of technology. First, you can see that the Mesopotamians are going to make some innovations in boat building technology. The earliest boats that we have records of, and when I say records, I mean like illustrations, like the one below there that was found on a clay cylinder, that show what a boat might look like. The earliest records that we have seem to depict and describe something called reed boats. There's not a lot of wood. There's not a lot of woodland or wood that grows naturally around the Tigris and Euphrates. There's palm wood, I suppose you could say. Not necessarily super suitable for building boats. But there are, however, lots and lots and lots of reeds that grow in the marshy delta area of the lower Mesopotamia. And so the way to build a reed boat is you take these reeds, and you find this technology kind of all over the world, implemented one way or another. You take these reeds and you bundle them together very tightly, and they're buoyant, they float. And when you bundle them together super tightly, not only are they naturally buoyant, but they're packed so tightly in that it provides an almost like watertight seal. And then that can be sealed also with things like pitch, which you can construct. I'm not going to get into the process of making pitch, but it's basically a sealant that's developed and built by ancient people, and they will paint their boats with it and seal in all of the cracks and make the thing watertight. And so these boats are constructed out of these bundles of really tightly packed in reeds. They're very buoyant, and they're very seaworthy on that account. They don't sink that easily. They can be smashed up, but they're pretty strong. And then over time, the first boats are used on the river, and they're mostly propelled by the river current and by poles. So people use a pole to push against the bottom of the river and move the boat up and down. Later boats will add sails to make it easier, faster to move, particularly against the current, to give themselves a little bit of a bonus, a little push. And over time in the Bronze Age, these boats evolve to be larger, more maneuverable, more seaworthy, so that they can leave the river system and move out into the Mediterranean itself and bring goods over long distances. Boating technology is super important to long distance trade because it is, bar none, the most efficient way to move bulky, heavy goods. If you're conducting a trade in tin, so you're trading tin, which is heavy and large, um, in exchange for grain, you need the ability to move heavy objects with the least amount of effort. If you try to do it over land, it is possible, but you have to put together wagons and oxen, and you have to have roads, which don't exist over most of Europe. It's not easy. It's very difficult and labor intensive and time consuming. You have to have food for the oxen. It's very hard. Moving stuff by water is much, much more efficient, and that goes a long way to explain, in part, why trade routes are going to follow waterways for the most part in the ancient world. It will expand later. Okay, so now, pardon me, you're probably wondering, what are the other things necessary to make trade over long distance possible? Well, there's really a couple of other factors. One is that you need organization. That redistributive economy of all of the farmers that surround the city, they're farming, their surplus is collected in taxes or rent. It kind of depends on what the situation is. It's gathered up in the city center, and then it's going to be redistributed out. And you have to have somebody who is able to make decisions about how you're going to spend that wealth. It's not in cash money. Cash money doesn't exist at this point. There is some trade in valuable metals like copper and tin, and gold will come up as well, which is mostly decorative. It doesn't have a lot of value in practical sense. But most of the trade that's taking place in the Bronze Age is going to be trade in barter. You have huge amounts of grain that are being swapped for things like useful metals that are going to be turned into tools, for instance. And so you have to have somebody who's making decisions. How much grain is necessary to feed the army? How much grain is necessary to have a trade negotiation with our neighboring city? How much grain is necessary to have trade with the long distance trade network that is bringing in tin? So somebody has to make this decision. In the earliest days of the cities, the very first cities that were created, Uruk and Ur, you can see they're in the box labeled Sumer. We'll talk about that in just a bit, toward the lower part of Mesopotamia. These cities were led by, and they were all independent of each other. They all had their own leaders, and they were led by people known as N or NC. And these N or NC people seem to be, we might describe them as priestly governors. They seem to be closely associated with religious temples, and that's where we see their names written down. They had some sort of priestly or ritual function in society, and they worked kind of like the mayor of the town. So that when decisions had to be made, they were consulted. They would consult with a council of elders, from what we can see, and then they would make decisions about what to do with the money, how to strategize protection for the city, whether to build a new wall or what to do. And that was what we saw as the chief kind of leader in the earliest cities. That's what the records tended to reflect and show. These people would make decisions, and then in order to have those decisions implemented, they needed another piece. The development of writing. This is going to emerge at the same time and in the same places that the first mature or large cities are going to emerge, and that's not a coincidence. The smaller your community is, if you were a hunter-gatherer band of 35 people, those types of communities do not have written languages, generally speaking. It's not that people are illiterate. It's not that there's a written language and they don't know it. They just don't have one. And there's a perfectly logical reason for that. If your whole community is 35 people and you travel around together and you can easily speak to each other about whatever you want, there's not really a reason you need to have a written language. You can simply remember what you need to remember. And it's not necessary to communicate at any distance with anybody, generally speaking. You can do everything face to face. And if necessary, if you really had to, you could send a messenger, and the messenger could speak to whoever it is that you want to speak to. When you're talking about large, complex communities living in cities, when you're talking about thousands of farmers and they all owe taxes, and you have to figure out how much they owe and how much they paid, and this is another thing that is true of agricultural societies, very often agricultural life is a system of indebtedness. So if you want to plant in the spring and you don't have enough grain, you have to borrow it from somebody, possibly from the city government, possibly from a rich person, who knows? But you have to borrow it, and somebody has to keep a record of how much you've borrowed and how much you agreed to pay back. And so some variation of this is true for basically everybody. The city determines how much people have to pay at the end of the year, whether it's rent or taxes. You need a record of it. If somebody has to get a loan of grain in order to do their planting, you need to have a record of that so you know who has to pay back what. In addition to that, long distance trade. If you're dispatching people to go off, possibly for years or months, to go collect the tin that you need to create the Bronze Age, you need to be able to send them with some clear instructions. You don't necessarily want to trust a messenger and then have that message be spread word of mouth down a long, complicated chain so that the person in Britain will eventually be like, oh, I'm at the end of this telephone game. If you ever played that telephone game where you whisper something to somebody and they whisper to the next person, by the time you get all the way around the room, it's a completely different message. You want to be able to keep your instructions intact. And so, what emerges in order to solve this problem? How are we going to keep records? How are we going to keep track of everybody and what they're all doing in a community of 10,000 people where we don't all know each other? How are we going to conduct trade at a long distance? For purely practical reasons, they developed the technology of writing. The earliest form that we find in Mesopotamia is pictographic. This is the earliest form of writing we find everywhere in the world, where there's just little symbols that are drawn that look like little pictures, and each picture will represent a word or a concept. Those are very hard for people to come around thousands of years later and figure out what they are, unless they really accurately depict what they're supposed to mean. It can be very difficult to translate pictographs. Later, what will evolve out of that is something we'll call cuneiform. And cuneiform, before I move on, I just want to point out both the vase, there's a beautiful sort of decorative scene on there that you can't really see because it's degraded. But on the top, you can see some of the writing system that will describe what's going on the vase and who it was made for and why it was a gift. It was dedicated as a gift to the god of war. And then the clay peg, that's a treaty that had the record of the treaty written on the peg, and then the peg was hammered into the nail, into the wall of a temple, meant to keep it kind of sacred and preserved forever. The writing system we're talking about is something called cuneiform, or wedge-shaped writing, and it evolves in Mesopotamia as a way to keep these kinds of records and to express whatever it needs to be expressed and create a permanent account of it. The fully mature version of cuneiform is a syllabic language where each of those symbols represents a syllable. And then you can combine them in any way that you want so that you can have the entire language rendered by this cuneiform writing. So you can write anything, a whole epic poem. You can write lists of goods. Many, many, many of the cuneiform tablets that survive that we have are pretty dry reading. They are mostly like tax lists. So it'll be like 4 sheep and 6 bushels of barley and 7 7 I don't know, bolts of cloth and a chicken. It really is just kind of lists of stuff, a lot of them. These types of tablets, we find them, there are actually lots and lots and lots of them. Shocking numbers when you consider how old they are. This one is a contract to buy a house, as it says in the thing, and it's really exciting for that reason. But it's from about 2600 BC, so it's 4,000 years old. They survive, and the reason we have so many of them is because they're clay tablets that have these words in cuneiform inscribed on them, and then they dry out so as to form a permanent record. But occasionally they're caught in fires. And when that happens, the clay tablet is fired. It becomes not just dried out, but kiln baked in essence, even though it's not in a kiln. And so if they're caught in this kind of record building fire, where the record building was, that they were stored in, they become super, super hard and will last basically forever. And so there's just tons of them around. Syracuse University has some in their special collections if you'd like to go see them. They're very cool. They're not as big as you might think because all the pictures are expanded to show the detail. They're a bit bigger than a Triscuit. They're about the size of a little Debbie brownie, maybe. They're like maybe 2.5, 3 inches square, is what they look like. They're really, really cool little things. But this represents the kind of mature form of writing that emerges in Bronze Age Mesopotamia, this cuneiform writing. And it is really kind of complex. Before we get into that, I'll show you a little bit of how it emerges. Okay, so writing as a technology actually evolves over time, and I find it kind of fun to talk about, so we'll just take a minute to discuss it. The very earliest, I guess, representational record keeping in Mesopotamia involved something that we wouldn't think of as writing now. Instead, 3D little tokens were created out of clay. And these tokens were meant to be kind of like a record keeping system, so that if you owed a bushel of barley, there would be a certain shaped token that would represent that. If you owed a goat, there would be a certain shaped token that would represent that. And so what you did when you had to keep a record of what you owed in your taxes is that these little tokens, these little clay tokens, would be put together, and then sometimes you can see the holes in them, strung on a string, and you would have your tax record kind of put in a building somewhere, the big tax collector's building, and put in a building somewhere, and this would be yours. And you'd have to remember where it was on the shelf. And at the end of the season, the growing season, when you went down to pay your taxes, they'd look down and they're like, here's the tokens. You probably have a copy of it yourself. You owe 4 bushels of barley and a goat, or whatever it is that your tokens indicated. And this was a kind of a standard shorthand way of keeping records. And that's what they represented. And so this lasted for a long time. People made these little tokens to indicate what the records were. But there were some complaints. They're like, wait, if you just have tokens on a string, well, people can alter that after the fact. You can take a token off and pretend you only owe 3 bushels of barley or whatever else. Or if you're sneaky temple priest, we don't trust you, maybe you add a few bushels after the fact. And I remember saying that I'd pay 3 bushels in taxes, and you now are asking for 5. I don't like it. We need a more secure system. So the next thing, if you look kind of over to the top right there, the next sort of step in this system of record keeping, in order to create secure records that would be sealed up during the growing season, so that a person would have their contract, they'd be like, I'm going to pay 3 bushels of barley and a goat. In order to keep that contract sealed so nobody could tamper with it, they created something known as these boluses or envelopes. They're really usually pretty round. And so you put the tokens inside this envelope, this clay ball, and you seal up the ball. You press your finger on it to indicate that's what it is. You put small indications. And then that sits on the shelf for the growing season. And then when it's time to pay your taxes, you go down, you crack open the ball, and you're like, yep, here's what we agreed. And nobody can have tampered with it because it has been sitting on the shelf sealed up this whole time. Well, that was a pretty good advancement, because now nobody can mess with what you agreed to. The downside is, though, that the growing season's kind of long. And if you're the temple record keeper and you're like, okay, I need to know how much people owe in taxes this year because I'm making some trade arrangements. I'm the NC, I'm making arrangements. And you go down and you're like, okay, how much is coming in? And then you just see all of these envelopes. You're like, oh, man, I don't know what's inside them, and I can't break them open because then they'll be invalidating the record, so I can't do that. So, bright lights that they are, they figured out, okay, so when we make the ball, I don't want it to be a mystery what's inside, so on the outside, I'll make little indications. So you can see on this bolus, it looks kind of like those tokens that you see, like there's 3 round ones that go kind of across the middle, and then on the bottom you see the 3 sharp ones. I'll make these little symbols on the outside of the clay ball so that I don't have to break it open. I can just see what's there. Seems like a good idea, right? So you can figure out what's going on in the middle of the season without having to break it. And then inside, you'll still have these tokens at the end, and the contract is approved. It takes a surprisingly long time for people to break with tradition. They do this for a while before somebody finally says, if you make something out of clay that dries up and hardens, and you put a symbol on it that indicates, what is owed, and then it hardens. Once it hardens, you can't change it really. It's really obvious that it's been scratched instead of smudged in with a stylus, a reed that you use to press the symbols in. It's really obvious that you've messed with it if you try to mess with it after the fact once it's dried. So honestly, if you have the symbols that say what's inside the envelope, you kind of don't need the tokens anymore. You can just put the symbols on and that's it. That's the origin of this cuneiform style writing. Somebody finally figured out you don't actually have to put the tokens inside. You can just put the mark that symbolizes it and then allow the clay tablet to dry, and it can't be tampered with, and you have a permanent record. So that's the very earliest kind of way this evolved. And the earliest text that we have, the words, as I mentioned, they're largely pictographic. They're sort of representational. It represents a bushel of grain. It represents a goat. It represents whatever it represents. There's not a ton of information. By the time cuneiform develops, where instead of using just a pictograph, they're using symbols that represent syllables, it's possible to record much more complicated things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we are going to read part of and discuss part of for our reading discussion this week. So you have your entire language is able to be translated into these symbols without having to learn 10,000 symbols, however many there are words. Instead, you can just learn a set number and then turn every word into this style of writing. That being said, cuneiform is fairly complex. It's not the easiest thing to pick up. We don't have any reliable numbers on the percentage of literacy in the Bronze Age. We just don't know what percentage of people in Bronze Age cities could read and write. We do know that people who can read and write were a special class, a class of people known as scribes, and that they did it professionally, which would indicate that most people probably can't read and write. Certainly can't write. They may be able to read, but they can't probably read and write. And so if they needed something written down, a record of the sale of a house, for instance, or if they wanted to send a letter, a message to somebody, they would have to go and hire one of these professional scribes to write it for them. And very likely, they might have to hire a professional scribe to read it for them if it came up and they had to examine the contract, for instance. So the system is fairly complicated. It's not super easy to master. It takes some time, it takes some expertise, and there were professionals who were in charge of recording writing in ancient Mesopotamia. And that writing, though, over time, as it gets closer and closer to the modern era, it is going to encapsulate lots of things about the culture and society. We have records on temples, we have prayers, we have hymns, we have accounts of warfare, we have epic poems, which we'll talk about in more detail when we do our reading discussion. And all of these things give us a little flash of insight into what life was like for Mesopotamia during that time period. Now, some of these writings, now we'll talk about this in more detail during our Zoom meeting, but some of these writings, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, are really, really persistent. You find the earliest hints at some of the portions, some of the stories in the Epic of Gilgamesh in Sumerian texts early in Mesopotamian history. And then you find, more than 2,000 years later, you'll find pictures that are taken from the Epic of Gilgamesh. You'll find a much expanded version of the Epic of Gilgamesh that will be written in Assyrian or Neo-Babylonian or various other languages of people who have conquered that same territory. So even though millennia pass, even though different people come to be dominant in Mesopotamia, this story retains its importance. It continues to be central and important to people. It's something people know, it's something people enjoy, and they translate it into whatever language their conquerors speak, and it's constantly in circulation. Okay, moving on. In addition to writing, we find other pieces of information as well, hints about what life was like. And so, kind of in the same way we looked at cave paintings to try to know a little bit about what life might have been like for Stone Age hunters and gatherers, you find art pieces in Mesopotamia that gives you some glimmer and insight into what life might have been like as well, particularly into how leaders wanted themselves depicted. This is something that's very important to emphasize. Many of the pieces of art that we've already looked at and will continue to look at, you have to remember, are being produced by people specifically who have the resources to commission them, that have the wealth to command artisans to carve or create these inlaid mosaics like this beautiful piece you see here. They are people who have means. They have money, they have influence, they have the ability to command artisans. And so they are very much manipulating and controlling the narrative for their own benefit. The people who create these pieces of art shouldn't, in the ancient world, be imagined as artists who are expressing their own feelings and views. Pretty much everything we're going to be talking about for some time in this class are specifically commissioned pieces that artisans were hired to produce, artisans were hired to produce in order to accomplish and spread the message of the person who's paying for it. Now, we don't always know who that person is. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And we don't necessarily always know what the message is. And so sometimes it's fun to look into it and we can kind of speculate. And sometimes you can get kind of a surprisingly vivid image. This particular object is very, very old. It's from about 2550 BC. It was found in a tomb. It's known as the Standard of Ur. And by standard, what they're talking about here, it's one of the definitions of the word, where a standard would be something like a flag or an image that would be held on like a pole or something that would announce the identity of a person who is marching in a parade or fighting in a battle. So you would be, instead of having just a flag with colors, etc., you might have a pole with a piece of wood on top of it, and on that would be painted a symbol, and that's what's known as a standard, so that everybody would know that's where Lord so-and-so is, or whatever. Anyway, this could be that. We're not entirely sure what this object is. It's about the size of a bread box, and it has two sides to it. It was originally kind of sort of shaped vaguely like a bread box, honestly. And it's this inlaid design that has some limestone in it. That's what that pale thing is. And also precious lapis lazuli. You see the beautiful blue background there? That's all kind of well, we'll probably call it a semi-precious stone now, but it was a precious stone. And so we have all these intricately carved little figures that are laid into a wooden framework to create this picture. And so some of it's a little degraded and broken down, but a lot of the pieces of it are intact, and we're pretty confident that we've reconstructed it accurately. So here we have this object, and it's found in the tomb of a king. And now we have to speculate on what it means and what it tells us about Mesopotamian society. All right, so looking at it, what you can see, it has two sides. This one is known as the peace side. What you can see by looking at the Standard of Ur here is very typical of what we find in a lot of ancient Bronze Age art styles. The people are depicted in a way that's not meant to be hyper-realistic. They're not meant to look lifelike. They are meant to be kind of symbolic, almost like a cartoon or a comic book, so that you make the people's faces and images kind of stylized and simplistic in order to make the story that's being told more clear, so that we're not focusing on how beautifully drawn each individual person is. Instead, we're like, oh, this person represents a person. What is the story of the picture? And you can find some really kind of standard iconographic kind of tells that we find in the Standard of Ur. So if you check out this image and you look at it for a second, you may be able to spot who the king is. I'll give you a second to look at it. If you check out that top level there, all the way to the left, you count in three kind of figures. The guy in the chair is so big, his head is bouncing out of the frame a little bit. He's too big for this whole box. He's so big that even sitting down, he's taller than the person standing in front of him. Now, remember what I just said about how in ancient artistic styles, it's very often to show people in a stylized or symbolic way, not in a hyper-realistic attempt to depict what they really look like. And when you see this kind of size difference, you shouldn't interpret this literally as to say that the man in the chair is a giant of some kind, as are those other people in chairs that are almost as big as him. And these small people are small people, children or, short people. Instead, you should read this symbolically. The person in the chair is depicted as bigger than everybody else. His clothes are fancier than everybody else. His skirt is really that cool kind of leaf thing. His clothes are fancier. He's bigger than everybody else. The people in the chairs are all staring at him. And what this likely means is that he's more politically important than everybody else in the picture. So you have everybody else is smaller, everybody else is dressed less fancily, and many of the people are all kind of making their way to stare at him directly. And this is an indication that whoever he is, he's important. You can interpret it any way that you like. You could imagine that this is the king. That's very likely. You could imagine he's an important priestly leader of some kind. That's also possible. We're not entirely sure, but we can read, even thousands of years later across the world, we can read this picture and take something away from it. Okay, so what else does this image show? You got this big guy, he's important. Then you have small people who are standing nearby with their arms crossed over their chests. You've got a musician way on the right side of that top panel, playing a harp there. And so all of these things are indications that you've got musicians, you've got servants. That's probably who those are, people with the arms crossed are. You've got another kind of panel of people all sitting in chairs holding up cups. We could assume that these are nobles or important people because they're sitting down in the presence of the really important guy. They've also got cups that they're raising, so that indicates that they have a certain amount of wealth and luxury they're enjoying. Then that middle panel, you have people who are moving animals. You're walking along, they're transporting these animals. You've got a bull, you've got a ram, and the animals are lovely, beautifully drawn, lots of detail, and the bulls have the blankets over them. They're really fancy looking, and they've got skirts that have a fringe on the bottom, and so these people seem like they're kind of middlingly important. And then on the bottom, what you have are people where there's not a lot of detail. Now, some of this is just damage, but their skirts are simple folded over skirts. They have animals, but the animals are not fancy or highly detailed. They look like they're probably donkeys. I guess they could be small horses, but they're probably donkeys. They've got donkeys there. The donkeys are kind of walking along. They don't have any fancy outfits on. Some of the people are actually schlepping bundles of things and carrying them. And so all of this would give you an indication that these are workers, right? These are low-class laboring worker people. And if you take all three together, it very much looks like it's a breakdown of the social classes. You have a noble class, you have a middle class, and you have this kind of laboring class. And all of them are presented in this very orderly way, all kind of contributing, all sort of doing what they're supposed to be doing. And what they're supposed to be doing is also subject for debate. It's possible, I would suggest, that what this is depicting here is something called a sacrifice. We'll talk about that in just a bit. Or a religious ceremony. We'll get into that. On the other side of the standard of war is the side known as war. And in this, we also have the big guy. He's been damaged a little bit, so he's not as detailed as he is on the other side. But you can tell where the king is, or the religious leader, whoever he is. Likely the king, because he's so tall, once again, his head doesn't fit in the frame. He's bigger than everyone else. That doesn't reflect any kind of reality. There's no indication that Sumerian kings were taller than other people. But it is an indication representationally that this person is more important in this picture. It's an indication of who he is relative to everybody else. And there's other clues as well in that top panel. You have soldiers, people who are dressed in armor, carrying spears that are standing behind him. You have a really tiny guy who's holding, it looks like he's hanging on to the reins of the horses there. There's 4 horses. You can tell there's 4 because they've put 4, you can see the outline of 4 legs, 4 tails, 4 heads, etc. There's 4 horses that are attached to a chariot, and then the chariot driver is standing on the ground holding on to the reins of the horses so they don't bolt away and waiting, and then there's an empty spot on the chariot. If you look at the bottom panel, you can see chariots kind of in action. There are horses that are moving. There's a chariot driver in the front, and on the back is a person with a spear. So there's a person who drives the chariot and a person who hurls the spear. And then you can see very gruesomely, if you look at the second and third, the middle and far right horses, you can see that there are people who are being trampled underneath the feet of the horses. It's very kind of macabre. It's gruesome. And you can see in this top panel, there's only one person and he's hanging onto the rein. So this is the driver of the chariot, and the person who would be sitting in it with the spear is likely that big guy in the middle, standing there with a spear. The people who are addressing him on the right are prisoners. There's soldiers, but then they're also kind of hanging on to and pushing people who are naked or not clothed very much. They're kind of seem to be tied up. They're beat down. They're being pushed forward. You can see the same thing happening in the middle panel. There's a row of soldiers on the left part. They've got helmets on, they've got cloaks, they've got weapons in their hands, and then there's a little bit of fighting in the middle, and then on the other side you have prisoners. You have people who are tied and bound. They're unclothed or clothed very simply, and they're being kind of led away. And the message on this side of the standard of Ur seems very clear as well. You have a king, he's on the top, he's in the middle, he's standing there very serene, he's not even in his chariot anymore, and what he's presiding over is a victory. You have all of these soldiers and the charioteers, and they've trampled over enemies, and everybody's been captured, and they are now his prisoners, and that's how it goes. On the earlier side, when we talked about those 3 kind of standards of society, all of those people seem to be dressed as civilians. You still had the king presiding in his chair as everybody raised their cup to him, but instead you have this very orderly, clear division of society. It's sort of similar on this war side, but instead of everybody sitting around peacefully, you can see how there's soldiers who are doing their soldiery work, and you have the charioteers, and you have the king himself who is presiding over the surrender of his enemies. So this is kind of the 2 parts of what the leader is supposed to do. They're supposed to have a peaceful administration on one side of their own people, and on the other side, they are shown as powerful leaders who defeat their enemies. Okay. Next up, we have even more detailed pieces of art to look at. We have other examples, and we have records increasingly that tell us a little bit about how kings are emerging in Mesopotamia. In the earliest days of Mesopotamian cities, when we go back to 4500 for Uruk, or more realistically in the 3000 range, when we have cities like Ur and Lagash who are founded and really become definable as cities, those cities all were self-governing. They had walls around them, they each had their own rulers, they controlled the city and the territory immediately around it, and that was it for the most part. Once in a while, you'd have a powerful leader of a city with a big army who was successful, who would try to capture the neighboring city. This happens. And so regional kingdoms kind of emerge, where people all speak the same dialect, the same language. The earliest of these was Sumer. I'm not going to make you learn all of the various dominant political groups in Mesopotamia because they change. This is one of the things you should learn about Mesopotamia, in that it is a fairly politically volatile area because it's vulnerable. Each of these city-states has a wall around it. Each of them has leaders. They will occasionally battle each other to try to enforce some kind of regional dominance, but it doesn't tend to last very long. The kings, if they want to control more than one city, have a lot of challenges ahead of them. First, they have communication. They can use cuneiform to get by on that. It's hard to rule effectively two cities at the same time because you can only be in one of them to see what's going on. Also, you have to trust people to actually carry out the job of ruling. You have to trust people and deputize them to collect taxes and keep law and order going in place in the city, to organized city defenses. And in Mesopotamia, they can't get rid of the city walls because there are outsiders from the Zagros Mountains, bandits who constantly come and attack. And so they have to maintain soldiers in each city, and they have to maintain walls for protection in each city. And this is problematic for kings because if they try to conquer a city and succeed, and then they tell that city, okay, now you belong to me and you have to do what I say, it's much easier a few years down the road for that city to be like, nah, I don't know. I don't really want to do what you say anymore. And now the king who's conquered that city now has to go back and reconquer it. And he's got to get past the city walls again. And he's got to fight the soldiers that are stationed inside the city again. And it becomes difficult in that way. And so Mesopotamian kings have to pull out all the stops. They have to convince places that they conquer and create into a regional empire. They have to convince them that it's in their best interest to back the king, to back his rule. So they have to provide benefits. And they do this in a number of ways. Sometimes by creating building projects. Building projects are great and enormously popular in the ancient world as they are in the modern world because they create jobs. It literally is a way to put money that you might have gathered through loot and warfare or conquering your neighbors or collecting taxes. It's a way to put money directly back into the environment because if you hire people to build a fabulous new temple, for instance, the way that Sargon of Akkad, that's to the northern part of Mesopotamia, he's going to move to the south and take over Sumeria and create an empire. If you're Sargon of Akkad and you build a fabulous new temple project, it accomplishes a lot of things all in one. One is it indicates to your people that you are pious and courting the favor of the gods. And this is reassuring to them. It's a good way. We'll talk about ancient religion in just a moment. It's a good way to reassure them that you care about their local allegiances, that you are respectful of the gods and not courting disaster by offending the local gods. It's a good way also to put money directly into the economy because if you're building a temple, you have to hire people to do the building. You have to hire people to quarry the stone. You have to hire people to transport the materials. You have to hire people to do the decoration. You have to hire people to work in the temple. All of this is a way to infuse money into the economy and give people things to do. It's also a way to express how your culture might be more compatible than the people you've just conquered might have initially thought. By showing respect to local gods, you show that you are not about to just swoop in and wreck everything. Instead, you have respect for their local culture. You can also try to draw connections between yourself and the people you have conquered. In the case of Sargon of Akkad, he's an Akkadian. He has conquered the lower part of Mesopotamia. He's turned it into an empire. And in order to bolster his claim to it and help himself, win the support of local populations, he builds a big temple, kind of a joint temple. And in this, he practices something that is called syncretism. Syncretism is where you take elements of one religion and smoosh it into elements of another religion and create a new fusion thing. And that's what Sargon does. He creates this new temple, builds it, very popular move, and he dedicates it not just to the local Sumerian goddess Inanna, but also to the Akkadian goddess Nana. They have very similar names. And so what Sargon does deliberately is he's like, aha, see how similar their names are? Inanna and Nana are actually the same. It's the same goddess with a slightly different name and description. Actually, our people and your people, they might appear on the surface to be different, but they're not different. We're all the same. It's great. So I'm going to build this fabulous temple, dedicate it to Inanna Nana, and I'm going to put my daughter in charge of it. Enheduanna was her name. And that beautiful kind of seal over there is a depiction of her. She's in the fancy dress in the middle. Enheduanna was appointed by Sargon to be the high priestess of this temple, and she had a big kind of administration to run. There was a lot of resources that the temple commanded. They gave out lots of food. They organized all kinds of celebrations, which we'll talk about in a bit. And it was therefore a way to have a really kind of popular connection with the local population. It also was a way for her to keep tabs and run the city, because she gets to approve all the major political decisions of domestic affairs that happen inside the city where she's in charge of the temple. She gets this job. That's what En means. That's the prefix of her name. It's like NC, the old priestly governor. So she's given this title, and she works for her dad, in essence, running this temple and keeping up good relations with the local population and actually running the administration of the city. In another piece of trivia, Enheduanna is the earliest named author we have. We have much earlier pieces of writing, cuneiform and the pictographic form of writing that existed in Mesopotamia before that. Some Egyptian writing is older as well. But this piece, the piece that we have that was written by Enheduanna, is the first thing we have where we know an author's name. So instead of some anonymous scribe that's written down a list of kings or whatever else, Enheduanna was appointed the priestess of this temple, and she writes a series of hymns to her goddess. And her name is attached to it so that we know that she actually wrote it herself. So she's not just the first female author we have the name of, she's the first author we have the name of at all. And so there she is. She's the deputy of Sargon of the Akkadian, and she's his daughter, and she's running the cities on his behalf. And he's using religious syncretism to try to convince the population that he's somebody to admire and support. And he's using his daughter's help to actually keep tabs on what people are doing in the city. Now, before I move on, I think I should focus a little bit and take a moment to speak in general about Bronze Age religion. Now, this is a broad generalization, so take it that way. Bronze Age religions, with a couple of exceptions, tended to be polytheistic. So, in other words, people believed in a pantheon of gods, not just one god, but they believed in multiple gods. Bronze Age religion also was very different from what we often think of as modern religions, in that especially in the early Bronze Age and to mid-Bronze Age, we find that people's vision of their gods, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about the reading, people's vision of their gods was not profoundly linked to morality. The gods are very often depicted as human-like or even childlike, arbitrary, dangerous, very powerful, but at the same time, not all-knowing, not all-seeing, and not everywhere in the world. Most Bronze Age people conceived of their gods as local. So in other words, there were gods of the city of Uruk, and then if you were to travel to the city of Lagash, there would be other gods that were in charge of that territory. If you were to move to Egypt, there would be different gods, and gods could move around if they wanted to, but for the most part, they lived where they lived. And if you were to pick up and be like, okay, well, I used to live in Uruk, but I think I might pick up stakes and move to Lagash, you would not, in the Bronze Age, consider continuing your reverence and continuing your allegiance to the gods of Uruk. You would be like, well, all right, well, there's no sense in praying to the Uruki gods because they're not here. I would pray to the new gods of Lagash because that's where I live. This kind of reflects one of the realities of Bronze Age religion. Most people don't consider it to be any kind of a personal connection. It's not really a moral connection. The gods are not looking out to see whether you're a good person or a bad person. As it gets later into the Bronze Age, this transforms a little bit. You do have gods that are concerned with justice. We'll get into that later. But for the most part, it's really not about that. Gods and people have this kind of reciprocal relationship in most Bronze Age cults. The idea is that people literally fuel the gods. They are going to be the ones that keep the gods healthy and happy, literally by feeding them through things called sacrifices. And give them devotion, which the gods like, and it strengthens them. And in return, the gods look out for the local area. They look out for the city and the population. They protect them from invaders. They protect them from disease. They protect them from disaster. And in return, the people are going to be offering their devotion. Now, when I say sacrifices, it's come up once or twice, so I should explain what that is in the ancient world. A sacrifice would be a civic celebration, a religious celebration. So the whole city would be doing this kind of at once. And in one of these sacrifice events, people will bring what it is they have to donate to the sacrifice. Sometimes you have people who are wealthy, or it will be the king himself who will simply fund the whole thing. He'll just pay for the whole sacrifice. And that was like a big celebration. But people bring stuff, and you would bring everything from kind of fragrant herbs to animals to vegetables to wine to oil, whatever it is that you have to donate. You would bring it to the sacrifice, and then there would be a ceremony where animals would be butchered. Sometimes there was a kind of a religious, well, there was always a religious ritual kind of surrounding that. And then the animals that had been sacrificed would be then put on a fire. The smoke would ascend to the heavens, some of it, and feed the gods. The idea was that this literally fed them. So you'd burn up your kind of fragrant herbs and woods. You would have the meat smell ascend to the heavens. You'd pour out a libation of wine, or when they started making wine and beer, or oil onto the ground. And this was meant to go into the gods and bolster them and strengthen them and make them more powerful. However, most of the meat that was produced in this way, by butchering the animals and putting them on the fire, was simply cooked, just the way we would have a barbecue or a grilled kind of roasted meal. It was cooked and then divvied up and given out to the people attending to the sacrifice. So these sacrifices were a place where everybody would come down, animals would be slaughtered, there'd be a religious ritual, but then everybody would have a barbecue fun time. So it was a celebration, and it was literally a way to put food in the mouths of the residents of these cities. And so if you were well-to-do, if you were a powerful, wealthy leader, or if you were a king, or if you were Enheduanna, the king's daughter, and you could pay for sacrifices and provide the animals for them, this was a way to really ingratiate yourself and make yourself popular with people, because you're having a barbecue, everybody comes down, we feel good about the fact that we're keeping the gods powerful and happy with us, and at the same time, we also get something to eat. And especially in these agricultural societies, people are working very, very hard. And most of their diet, this is one of the key changes between hunter-gatherers and pastoralists that follow herds of animals that they keep with them, and agriculturalists. Agriculturalists work a lot harder. We see that in the evidence of their bodies. Their joints are much more damaged. Their life expectancy is often shorter, oddly enough. And they have just show signs of a lot more difficult labor. Their diet is also what you find in the forensic records of early agriculturalists, is that their diet is often quite a bit poorer than what we find in hunter-gatherer groups as well. They're not getting as much protein, they're not getting as much variety in their diet, they're eating a lot of the same thing. And even though there's lots of calories in barley, for instance, it isn't necessarily a complete diet. It's not something that's healthy in the way that most hunter-gatherer diets were healthy. Now, there were hunter-gatherers who starved to death, don't get me wrong, and there are going to be agriculturalists who starve to death. There are agriculturalists who live pretty well and have access to lots of different vegetables and meats and things along the line, but a great percentage of them, when we're speaking generally, most workers, most common people are getting by on a poorer quality diet and doing much harder, heavier work than pastoralists and hunter-gatherers before them. And so these celebrations where their barbecue is being held is really important to the lives of these city-dwelling agriculturalists, because in some cases, this is their chance to supplement their diet and actually get a little bit more protein and get a little more food and actually eat a bit better than they would have otherwise. All of the stuff we've talked about so far is a way that kings are using what influence they have and what power they have to make themselves popular with people. The other thing we have to talk about with kings and their controlling of their image is the military aspect of it. This is another way in which these early cities represent a significant change from the lifestyle of hunter-gatherers or pastoralists, people who travel with their herds of animals. Once people settle into cities, we referenced this earlier, they become sitting ducks in some way. They're producing valuable commodities, surpluses of food. There are tons of people who would love to take it from them. Either the residents of other cities that live nearby or bandits that live in the mountains. There's no shortage of people who would like to swoop in and steal their stuff. So, one of the chief services that a leader needs to provide, and this goes beyond the NC or priestly governor and into what we'll call the Lugal or big man style ruler. What they need to provide is security. And city dwelling is going to provide the resources necessary for people to specialize. They build bronze weapons, they build bronze armor, and you have people who spend a full-time job. They spend all of their time providing security, and in some cases providing more than security. They end up being conquering armies that go in and take over people in the neighborhood. So you have people who are full-time soldiers, and you have commanders of full-time soldiers. That's the Lugal, the big man. And we'll call these guys who take on the job of both NC and Lugal kings, for lack of a better word, because they're the military leader and also kind of the mayor figure. And they are, by the time we get to the middle of the Bronze Age and onward, going to be the figures that are controlling the city-states and the kingdoms that emerge around them. And they are going to promote images of themselves. Part of what they do, we've already talked about with the Standard of Ur, where they depict themselves kind of the leader of a peaceful, well-ordered society, and the victorious leader over enemies. And then we talked about Sargon and his daughter and creating the temple. So they're the people who are organizing religious ritual, keeping the gods happy, keeping people employed, keeping people literally fed through their intervention. And you also have, very commonly in Mesopotamia, kings depicting themselves with images showing how powerful they are militarily. And these images are a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they're meant to be intimidating, and you can really see that with this image. This is the Stella of Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, and it's this kind of pillar of rock on which is carved this relief sculpture. And it's this kind of like mountainside. You can see Naram-Sin, he's climbing up a mountain there. He's followed and attended by people kind of below him that are dressed as soldiers. They have helmets on, and they're carrying standards. That's what those are. Where you see the pole, and there's kind of a symbolic thing on top of the pole. Those are standards, and then some people have spears below that. There's more soldiers. They're following him and looking up to him. He's far larger, the king, than anybody else that's in this picture. He's got a horned helmet to indicate how powerful and possibly godlike he is. He's got a bow and arrow that he's not even using. He's just kind of hanging on to it. A spear there. That might be an arrow, or it might be a spear in his hand. And then you see his enemies in front of him. It's really clear what the message is supposed to be. You have the one person holding up his hands on the far right there, begging for mercy. You have another person who's got a spear in his neck and he's falling down dead. You have the person that's under the feet. You can see literally under the feet of the king there. There's a person who's falling off this mountainside. He's dead and flailing, and he's falling to the ground. And so the message is crystal clear, right? If you look at this, what is the king trying to tell us? Because he hired somebody to make this, to build it and put it up in his city. And the message is crystal clear. The enemies of the king are powerless ahead of him. They beg for mercy. They don't even get it. They get stabbed in the neck, knocked off the pyramid. Well, it's a mountain. They get knocked off the mountain, and they are squidged, and they have no chance of fighting against him. You have the king who is triumphant and so powerful nobody could possibly fight him. And he's got his loyal soldiers, and they're backing him, and everything is a great story of a fantastic victory here. So, on the one hand, that's crystal clear. If you're thinking about attacking the king, The message is supposed to be real obvious to you. That's a terrible idea. He's far more powerful than anybody else. Nobody can stand against him. That would be futile. It's just ridiculous to try to fight the king. And this is meant to be intimidating if you're the kind of person who's thinking about attacking the king. It's also, when he commissions a picture like this and puts it up in the middle of a city, the other side to that is that it's meant to be reassuring. By depicting himself as effortlessly defeating his enemies, he's not just trying to intimidate people who might be thinking about rebellion. He's also trying to reassure people who are counting on him to keep them protected and safe from outside invasion, and saying, don't worry about it. If anybody comes and attacks you, I will kill them dead, no problem. I've got your back. I'll keep you protected. I'm so powerful, you don't have to worry about things. This is one of the advantages that Mesopotamian kings are offering to their people. Back me up politically. Pay your taxes. Don't rebel, because I can offer you security. I can offer you prosperity. I can offer you new temples that are dedicated to the gods. I can offer you peace and quiet and order. I can offer you these things, and if you try to rebel against me, I can take all that away and wreck it for you. So these things that are put up, these monuments, are meant to be this part of this PR campaign to keep everybody loyal. Now, the last thing I want to talk about today, and I'm just going to introduce it and we'll talk about it in more detail next week, because this will be a big part of our reading discussion, is another one of the perks that Mesopotamian kings are going to offer. They're trying to convince people to stay loyal, and that's hard in Mesopotamia. The fact is that there are invaders from outside that constantly destabilize things. All of the cities have their own guard. They have their own walls around them. So it's really easy for local leaders to try to lead rebellions. And there's just constant waves of people who invade and take over. There's Sumerians, and there's Akkadians, then there's Babylonians, and there's Assyrians, there's Babylonians again. It just kind of comes in one wave after another wave after another. And you don't have to know what they all are. Just know that in Mesopotamia, that's the reality, is that there's a lot of relatively unstable dynasties that are formed and then kind of collapse, and then a new dynasty takes over. That's what happens in Mesopotamia. And so for Mesopotamian kings, they have to be hardworking to try to convince people to stay loyal to them. We talked a little bit about syncretism and the other perks and images of themselves that the kings try to use as powerful and undefeatable, etc., in order to keep people on the same page. But what they do in Mesopotamia goes a little further than that. This is an image of the Stella of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was the king of Babylon. It was one of the groups of people that take over Mesopotamia in the 1700s. And he is going to publish a law code. It's not the very earliest law code, that's a few centuries earlier, but it is one of the most complete ones. So we have almost the entire text that survives of his law code. It's inscribed on this stone. It's about 7 feet tall, the stone. And you can't read it or see it, but you can sort of see in the detail. If you see the picture of the two figures that are standing there, if you look at the very bottom, you can see the cuneiform that's written down. And so this stone is a literal copy of the law code that Hammurabi passes. Now, we're going to talk about what that law code means and what it's all about in our discussion. And we're going to read passages of it for our primary source reading as well. But what you should know in the context of this lecture is that by granting a written law code, what Hammurabi is doing is he's offering one more perk. He's presenting himself as the person who is administering justice to the cities that he controls, so that local leaders can't just use their power and influence to make up the law, doing whatever it is they want to do. Instead, the king guarantees that there will be one standard for everybody. This is something we find in Mesopotamia, but we don't find elsewhere. We'll talk about why that is in our fun discussion coming up next. Okay, so that's it. Thanks a lot for watching.